Oh, tonight I'm going to engage in a little bit of what used to be called, when I was in elementary school, social studies. History and geography are going to feature in a big way tonight. Lots of charts, graphs, oh, pretty pictures, lots of color, so should be engaging. That's what instructors always aim for. Anyway, so I want to talk about the history of Buddhism in an hour and a half or less. So last time we saw the Buddha, he was just finishing off his first sermon to those 5 companions of his in the deer park at Sarnath, I think it was. For the next 45 years following his first sermon, Gautama Buddha taught all classes of men and women, kings and peasants, Brahmins and outcasts, bankers and beggars, holy men and robbers, without making the slightest distinction between them. He recognized no differences of caste or social groupings, which was a big deal in those days. The way, or Dharma, he preached was open to all men and women who were ready to understand and follow it. In his first sermon, the Buddha referred to it as the middle way because it consciously chose a path midway between sensuality and asceticism. I have to share my screen here. Okay, I'm just going to continue on with the list I had from last time, which means that I'd ask Joey to read our first number tonight.
Monks, these 2 extremes should not be followed by one gone forth into the renunciant life. What 2? That which in this pursuit of sensual happiness, in sensual pleasures, which is low, vulgar, the way of ordinary people, ignoble, not connected to the goal. Sorry. Not connected to the goal, and that which is this pursuit of self-mortification, which is painful, ignoble, not connected to the goal. Monks, without veering towards either of these 2 extremes, the Tathagata, another title for the Buddha, has awakened in the middle way, which gives rise to vision, which gives rise to knowledge, which leads to peace, to higher knowledge, to full awakening, to nirvana.
Okay. So the Buddha passed away in a place called Kushinagar in modern Uttar Pradesh. I'm just going to pull this up here. You can see in the center of your screen there. He entered Mahaparinirvana. That's the type of nirvana you attain when you actually die. He was 80 years old. So this scholars now believe occurred in 404 BCE. His final interaction with his companions has been recorded in a sutra called the Mahaparinirvana Sutra. So that's, we'll go back to our readings and then see if Bill Kelly could read number 2 for us.
Monks,
Number
these
2.
2 extremes. Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, number 2, Bill.
Oh, number 2, I'm sorry. Reading number 2, 6.5. Then the Lord addressed the monks, saying, it may be monks that some monk has doubts or uncertainty about the Buddha, the Dhamma, the Sangha, or about the path or the practice. Ask monks. Do not afterwards feel remorse thinking, the teacher was there before us and we failed to ask the Lord face to face. At these words, the monks were silent. The Lord repeated his words a second time and a third time, and still the monks were silent. Then the Lord said, perhaps monks, you do not ask out of respect for the teacher. Then monks, let one friend tell it to another, but still they were silent.
Okay, and then thank you, Bill. And the next reading just continues on from that. And I'll ask Lisa if she wouldn't mind reading this one.
And the Venerable Ananda said, "It is wonderful, Lord. It is marvelous. I clearly perceive that in this assembly there is not one monk who has doubts or uncertainty. You, Ananda, speak from faith. But the Tathagata knows that in this assembly there is not one monk who has doubts or uncertainty about the Buddha, the Dhamma, or the Sangha, or about the path or the practice. Ananda, the least one of these 500 monks, is a stream winner, incapable of falling into states of woe, certain of nibbana." Then the Lord said to the monks, "Now, monks, I declare to you, all conditioned things are of a nature to decay. Strive on untiringly." These were the Tathagata's last words.
So it's amazing that we have that. The idea of being a stream winner is that you've done enough in your life to accumulate enough positive karma that you're able to enter the stream of the Dharma. So that's the first stage of becoming a Buddhist or being a Buddhist.
Mark, are you coming back to reading too? Because I don't fully understand the
ahead.
gist of it. While he asked them to speak, but they were silent. What's that all about?
Well, he was giving them every opportunity to clarify for themselves any aspect of his teachings that he promoted in 45 years. He knew very well that he was about to die, and they probably sensed the same thing. And so this was their last chance to find out exactly any answer they needed to a question they had.
Oh, I get it now. Okay, I see. I thought he was telling them to speak or talk
Yeah, he
to
was.
them.
Yeah, he was trying to encourage them to say what was on their mind if they had any kind of doubts. And then in number 3, he says, it's obvious that none of the people in front of me, and there was a big crowd, have any doubts. So he felt his job was done. So given the supremely practical nature of Buddhism, the Buddha did not create an intricate set of metaphysical doctrines. Instead, he advised his followers to adhere to a series of ethical guidelines or precepts. Over time, the Buddhist Dharma came to include ever more exacting lists of precepts. However, they all derive from 5 basic ethical guidelines. These right here. Abstain from taking life. Abstain from taking what has not been given. Abstain from inappropriate sexual conduct. Abstain from false speech. Abstain from alcohol or drugs that cause heedlessness. Interesting how many of these have continued on right up to our present day. So the first principle teaches us that all beings have the right to live. This leads many Buddhists towards vegetarianism, although some monks eat some meat if it is given to them. The second principle reminds us to respect the rights and welfare of others. The third shields Buddhists from reckless masturbation, promiscuous sex, adultery, and rape. Tantric sex, by contrast, focuses on enlightenment, not on the sex. The fourth guideline requires Buddhists to refrain from lying, for this creates bad karma. And the fifth principle, prohibiting the use of drugs and alcohol, helps Buddhists to remain mindful and to concentrate on enlightenment rather than on physical pleasure. So the next graphic is a little more detailed. So you can see in the left-hand column here, the 5 precepts we just talked about, maybe in slightly different language. This then expanded into 8, and then into 10, and then 16, and then hundreds if you were a Buddhist monk. So monks typically follow many more precepts than lay believers, often numbering in the hundreds. These may include observing the correct mealtime, which is once a day after sunrise but before noon. No eating in the afternoon or evening. Avoiding music, dance, and entertainment. Relinquishing vain objects such as jewelry, perfume, and makeup. And abstaining from sleeping in luxurious beds or sitting on lush seats. And in fact, the monks aren't even allowed to lie down when they sleep. No matter how many they observe, a good Buddhist remembers that these should be guides rather than laws. Following a precept ought never to become an end in and of itself. Rather, each one is a signpost on the road toward breaking the power of samsara. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the historical spread of Buddhism. During the first 500 years after the death of the Buddha in 404 BCE, Buddhism spread over the whole of the Indian subcontinent. Trade based in Bangladesh and Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, then carried Buddhism to Southeast Asia, Burma, Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam. From the 1st century onward, after the turn of the millennium, Buddhism spread across Central Asia via the Silk Road, trade route to China, moving then to Korea and Japan in the 4th century. About the same time, it became established in Nepal. By the 7th century, Buddhists began the centuries-long task of converting Tibet. We'll have more to say about that in a future course or class. Within the next 1,000 years, Buddhism had established itself as the main religion throughout Asia. All this work of conversion was a slow process, as vast areas were being covered over long and difficult trade routes, and through different countries where a great variety of different languages were spoken. Thus, an enormous amount of translation work was involved over these centuries. As you can no doubt imagine, this is a vast subject unto itself. Not being an expert in the spread of Buddhism, I have shared 4 handouts to highlight some of the key events in different formats. So the first handout lists 14 key events in a simple chart. To give you an idea of the sense of time here. So the death of the Buddha, well, the life of the Buddha was in the 5th century BCE. King Ashoka, who we, I think, have had mention of, was in the 3rd century BCE. Mahayana Buddhism, which we're going to be talking about in the coming class, started somewhere in that 200-year period around the turn of the millennium. Mahayana Buddhism started spreading to Central Asia in the first half of the 2nd century. Buddhism enters China in the 1st century. The very famous Zen patriarch Bodhidharma arrives in China in 520. Buddhism enters Japan from Korea just 18 years later. Vajrayana Buddhism, which we'll talk about, established itself in Tibet. Theravada Buddhism established itself in Southeast Asia. Now, Nalanda University was actually destroyed in 1199. This was a center of learning where thousands of learned monks worked together. It's in Bangladesh, I think, now. And then in the 13th century, that's when you have the start of Zen Buddhism, Pure Land Buddhism, and Nichiren Buddhism in Japan. due to my lack of resources, we're not really going to say much about any of those three. That's one of the things you'll notice is that I've tended towards focusing on Sri Lanka with Theravada Buddhism, and I'm now going to switch focus to Tibet for the Mahayana and Vajrayana versions. And that's largely because of the fact that I have not been able to go to a library for 2 years. So I've had to rely on my own resources. And as it turns out, I had collected more things about Tibetan Buddhism than any other form, which I've supplemented over the last 6 months, quite heavily actually, with new purchases. The Pali Text Society was founded only in 1881. That's where we have the as close to authentic writings of the Buddha as possible. And it was introduced to the world at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 1893, which I believe was also the first place that Baha'u'llah's name was mentioned to the world. And then in 1956, 2,500 years of Buddhism is celebrated. So that just gives you a glimpse of what's going on during that period of time. So the second item on the list is the reign of King Ashoka. This represents a high water mark of early Buddhism. Ingrid, would you be willing to read number 4 for us, please?
Buddhism remained confined to northern India for 200 years, but later began to spread under King Ashoka's power, 274 to 232 BC. After the king waged a bloody war with devastating losses to expand his kingdom, he felt deeply remorseful and converted to the peaceful and tolerant teachings of Buddhism. He used the Buddha's Dharma to reform his government and sent Buddhist missionaries throughout India, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, China, and North Africa. And that's from Lee Merriman, The Story and Spread of Buddhism.
Well, the second handout I have is a large-scale map of Asia, which shows the routes over which Buddhism traveled at different periods of time. I think it's this one, yeah. Okay, so you can see that it started in Sarnath in Upper India, and then went in all sorts of different directions. So one of the earliest ones was down to Sri Lanka, down at the tip of India. And from there, it went to China. It doesn't have all the arrows going on here, but it does. It goes to Burma and Thailand and Laos, etc., and eventually to Vietnam. And from there, it also goes all the way over to Java. Alternately, there's also a spread in India itself across the whole continent to Ajanta, where there's a famous set of caves. And then it goes up north, and this up above Tibet here is the Silk Road that eventually takes it down into China through 2 different routes. And from there it goes to Korea, to Japan. So in China, you have Chan Buddhism, which becomes Zen Buddhism in Japan. But there are also other versions that come along at the same time. So, and it's all color coded depending on the time frame. So you can see there's a vast amount of information that we're just skimming lightly over here. If anybody was to get interested in this, one of the best places to, believe it or not, to start is Wikipedia. They have over 200 articles on Buddhism. I was staggered at how much there was there, with links to other resources. So that's a great place if you were interested in following up. So the third handout here is arranged by date across the top, as you can see in this line here. There. and it's color-coded to indicate which of the 3 vehicles of Buddhism predominated in 5 different geographical areas. So in bright yellow, you have Theravada Buddhism in the early schools near the top here. The orange sections, there's some at the top, Mahayana, and also down below in East Asia, the Chan Buddhism in China. Also, well, there's several others here. These, I think, are all in Japan, Tiantai and Jingtu. All right. The red sections, so Vajrayana up at the top. This is in Tibet, Nyingma, and you'll see a whole series of small words in here. These are groups or schools within Tibetan Buddhism that we're going to talk about a little bit in the 10th class, sorry, which I'm just about to work on now. And dark yellow sections, which are mixtures. Which is the mixture? Oh, okay. So these, the Theravada in the, beside Sri Lanka along here, and then the earliest Buddhist schools here represent mixtures of different forms of Buddhism in different parts. So it gets really complex pretty quickly, as you can see. So by the time you get to 1200, there are 3 main versions of Buddhism, and then many smaller schools within each of them. So let's not dwell on that longer than we have to. But I've just picked out a few events that stand out from this chart. So Theravada Buddhism was established in Southeast Asia around 250 BCE. And that's this early Buddhist schools, bright yellow. So Mahayana Buddhism arose around 500 CE, about 750 years after Theravada. There were early versions or early expressions of Mahayana, but it didn't really become coordinated until that point. And at about the same time, Chan Buddhism was established in China, down here below. And we saw that Buddhism entered Japan just 18 or 38 years later through Korea. And then we saw that Vajrayana Buddhism was first established in Tibet in the 7th to the 8th centuries. And this early version was to be called Nyingma, which is the ancient version or the ancient school. And then Zen, Pure Land, and Nichiren Buddhism are all established in Japan in the 13th century. So down here, long time later. So they're relative newcomers. So if that didn't confuse you, let's keep going. The next handout shows all the countries to which Buddhism spread along with the dates of its arrival. The legend in the bottom left is easier to read than the dates over top of the map itself. So if you're interested, take a look at this section right here. Long, complicated history. As you can see, it affected virtually all parts of Asia, with probably the exception of Siberia. Okay. Then I have one last one. Just to really throw this, you can see why I sent these to you ahead of time so that you could at least familiarize yourself with them and see whether you were interested in following them up. And here's the last one. This combines the geographical spread, the dates associated with each stage, and the paths Buddhism traveled, or Buddhists traveled as they carried their message. So you can see this route up here over the Silk Road down into China. The route through Sri Lanka to Southeast Asia. Now this one doesn't show that route down into Malaysia or Indonesia very well, but anyway, you do have to use more than one map if you're going to get a complete picture of what's going on. Books and books have been written about this subject. Okay. So, since the Buddha died in 404 BCE, his faith has had a long, complex history. Over the centuries, at the same time that it was migrating to numerous countries in Asia, it was disappearing from its home country of India. By the year 1200, it had all but totally been totally eliminated from its birthplace. There were multiple reasons for this extermination. Here are two of the main causes. One was the assimilation of many of Buddhism's teachings by Hindus, who perceived little difference between Hinduism and Buddhism in many respects. So this assimilation was furthered by the great Hindu theologian Shankara, who died in 820, who developed a form of monasticism that paralleled that of the Buddhist Sangha. He also made use of the Buddhist concept of the two levels of truth, relative and absolute, in his influential writings. A second major factor in the departure of Buddhism from India was the Muslim invasion of India. Buddhism's lack of a military spirit made it impossible for it to withstand the might of the Islamic holy war as it surged across the subcontinent. We have a reading about that one. That's number 5. How about Alan?
The Sangha, whose survival is essential for the flourishing of Buddhism, was an easily identifiable and thus vulnerable institution. The devastation of agriculture due to the invasions also meant that the laity no longer had surpluses to support their monks. The Sangha thus died out in most areas and could not be revived without existing monks to ordain new ones. Between the alien Muslims and their doctrinal justification of a holy war to spread the faith, the Hindus, closely identified with Indian culture and with a more entrenched social dimension, the Buddhists were squeezed out of existence. Lay Buddhists were left with a folk form of Buddhism and gradually merged into Hinduism or converted to Islam. Buddhism therefore died out in all but the fringes of its homeland, though it had long since spread far beyond it.
Curious situation. So I'd like now to turn your attention to the 3 major branches of Buddhism as we find them in the world today. Although Buddhism has made great inroads into Europe and North America in the last century, the vast majority of its followers still live in the countries of Asia we just reviewed. So we've mentioned Theravada, Mahayana, and Vajrayana, and these are the particular countries where they're the strongest, or where they predominate. So because of their geographical locations, some scholars refer to Theravada as Southern Buddhism, Mahayana as Eastern Buddhism, and Vajrayana as Northern Buddhism. This classification system has the merit of eliminating the value judgments inherent in the older terms, lesser and greater vehicles. So the lesser is the Hinayana and the greater is the Mahayana. So the next graphic shows you where the bulk of Buddhists live at the moment. and the types. You can see there's a legend down the left-hand side here. I'll give you a moment to absorb that. And of course, this excludes the many thousands of Buddhists who live in Europe and the Americas. But there are millions of people here on this map. So has anybody got any questions they want to throw at me at this point?
And I'm trying to
I see a
find-
hand, Belinda, what would you like?
Okay, you-
It is.
Yeah, David and I were both wondering about this event in 1199, the destruction of the Nalanda University.
Hmm,
Do you know what was involved in that?
um, Actually, I have to say, I don't remember very much about it.
Okay.
But-
We'll go to Wikipedia.
Yeah, it'll tell you for sure.
Well, Mark, can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
You know, Nalanda is really important. It was there for about 1,000 years, I think from around 200 CE to, 1200, but it started to thin out under Islamic domination from maybe 1,000 in the Common Era on. But what I find fascinating is it taught not only Buddhist texts and meditation and practices, but things like grammar and what we would call sciences of various kinds. So and it got up to maybe 7,000 or 8,000 people, or students at various times. And the Chinese got there and absorbed a lot of teachings and got some texts and brought them back home. Anyway, Nalanda is I think very important in looking at Buddhism as a civilizing influence, right? Influencing education and social teaching as well as spiritual teaching. Anyway, that's more about the Nalanda itself rather than its destruction, but that was a tremendous loss. And they made it a World Heritage Site. What's left of Nalanda is a World Heritage Site today.
Well, thank you for that. That's excellent information.
It's always a desperately sad thing when you hear about a university or a library being destroyed or burned or whatever.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
And that was what we were kind of focusing on that. And I also wonder, because given that time, this was just about when the expansion of the Mongols in Central Asia was happening. So I wondered if there was any connection with that as well.
Forgive me, I didn't focus on that particular event, so
Can't focus on everything.
that's true.
Can I make one? Yeah, well, I'm fascinated with, the extent in Asia. It was slow, but after King Ashoka, the extent of Buddhism on its different forms throughout Asia. And then I thought, well, Islam has been mentioned, and when you consider the extent of the influence of Islam, in the Middle East and even in Europe, these two together, it seems to me quite a remarkable thing when we consider, the whole idea of in the Baha'i faith of progressive revelation. And I remember the Shoghi Effendi saying that he said that in a sense that all the past revelations are preparation, for the coming of Baha'u'llah, or the Bab and Baha'u'llah. It's just, with the so-called Western religions, if the whole thing ends up coming together in terms of the growth of Christianity, the growth of Judaism before that, and so on. And I just think it's utterly fascinating.
You won't get any argument from me. Okay, Margaret, you've got your hand up there. What are you up to?
I'm just thinking that Buddhism seems to be sustained through monasteries and monks. And I'm wondering if they're the ones that would transcribe the writings of the Buddha, maintain them, and disseminate the religion. And I'm wondering what the role of family and particularly women are in Buddhism. And if that is just secondary.
Well, the material I've been reading suggests that there are three groups in Buddhism, all equally important. One is the monks and nuns. One is the group they call forest dwellers, the ones who are on their own in retreat. And then there are lay people who are both male and female. And each of them has played a key role at different times, or many different times. It's easy to focus on the role of the monks, but I'm not sure that that's telling the whole story. And you have to realize that the literature around this subject is vast. So I haven't actually touched on the subject you just raised now, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't already been extensively covered. It's just that my time is limited and I have to choose a path for myself.
Mark, can I add a little bit? Sorry.
Oh, just one more comment. Going over to Thailand and seeing there are numerous sightings. You see lots of monks around, and you see lots of stupas and lots of temples and lots of Buddhists. I have yet to recognize a nun, so I'm not anyway. I don't know whether I've ever seen a religious female in Thailand.
Interesting. Okay, Harold, what were you going to say?
Oh yeah, briefly. I just want to mention that one of the important Mahayana scriptures is called the Lion's Roar of Queen Srimala. Queen Srimala. And to the extent that she was an historic figure, she's a contemporary. She was a contemporary of the Buddha. I tend to believe that it's a true story and that she just was spiritually brilliant and read a few letters that her parents had written about the Buddha's teaching. And she started to teach this doctrine of the Buddha nature of all people. All people have potential Buddha nature. And it became, a pretty important part of Mahayana teaching, the Lion's Roar of Queen Srimala. And another thing is, I forgot, Mark, you may remember the name of there were, a flowering of statues I'm trying to remember. See, it was basically a Buddhist woman saint that became sort of mythologized. And so statues were built all across Southeast Asia, and I'm forgetting her name, but lovers of Buddhist art are kind of stunned. And I happen to see a lot of these Buddhist statues of women bodhisattvas that are quite stunning. So they show even a higher degree of compassion, I think, than the male bodhisattvas. So, there is some element of the feminine spirituality in Buddhism, if you dig it up. There are some sources for it.
I wonder,
However, I would add to Margaret's question, there's definitely no equality between the monks and the nuns in Buddhism. Margaret, I was reading recently that there's a whole protocol. If nuns are in the presence of monks, they are to remain standing. Although I noticed that the Dalai Lama himself doesn't observe this, and Thich Nhat Hanh didn't observe it either. I don't know where and when that was, but theoretically that was the practice. And of course, monks were never to touch women and so on and so forth. So there was definitely no equality between the Sangha and the nuns in Buddhism. The monks were definitely considered to be superior and expected to be treated as such. I'm glad to hear what Harold said about the feminine bodhisattvas. That's very, very interesting. But yeah, there's no doubt that the Sangha, the monks are viewed as being at the core of the thing. I have no knowledge at all about the role that the laity played in the spread of Buddhism, but definitely it's a priestly dominated religion. There's no question about that. And if you were in Thailand, you know that the general population considers it a great honor to feed a monk and so on and so forth, right?
Well, Belinda, you had your hand up at one point. Did you have a comment or?
You're muted, Belinda. There you go.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, I was wondering, and I've lost the name myself, but there's a sort of goddess of mercy, and I can't get the name out of my head. And I'm wondering if that's who you were thinking of, Harold. Lots of statues.
Yes, I think that's the same figure. And there's a Chinese name for her and a Japanese name for her.
Yeah, there's
And
a
I can't
Chinese.
remember it.
Yeah,
Was it Kuan Yin?
Yes, thank
Yeah.
you, Kuan Yin. Yes,
Hey,
Yeah, I've heard that.
yeah.
3 heads are better than 1, I think.
that's what you call
I've
consultation.
heard that. Yeah.
Excellent. Okay. So Margaret, I don't think that answered your question, but sounds like a research project, actually. Okay, so let's keep going.
I think
So
it's
we've already discussed the Hinayana vehicle, which is also known as the Theravada vehicle. Many scholars refer to it as Southern Buddhism due to its location in Southeast Asia in Sri Lanka, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Laos, and Bangladesh. This group of Buddhists follow probably the oldest form of Buddhism available in today's world. The Pali word Thera means elders. Thus, the term Theravada refers to the teaching of the elders. Theravadins generally agree as to the canon of scripture to which they adhere. By contrast, there are millions of Mahayana Buddhists in China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan, and Vajrayana Buddhists in Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, and Mongolia, as well as some in India or in China and Japan. These branches do not agree with each other or among themselves as to the specific books which constitute their sacred scriptures, nor do they share the same doctrines. The path of the way of the Buddha, the Dharma, is eternal. As we have seen, the spiritual teachings, particularly related to ethics and morals of Buddhism and the Baha'i faith, are very similar. Let's go back to our readings. I think, oh, I've got the number wrong here. Okay, so this should be number 6 on my page. I haven't updated it. Gone through too many iterations. Okay, Belinda, would you read number 6 for us, please?
Could you unmute? Oh,
There we go.
Okay, number 6.
Can you read it?
Hinayana outlines the fundamental Buddhist ideas of suffering, karma, and non-ego that will be refined in 2 higher vehicles. It also describes the basic Buddhist meditation practice of tranquility, shamatha, and insight. I'm not even going to try that, which again are taken up and refined in Mahayana Vajrayana. It articulates the goals, of renunciation and surrender that form the basis of Buddhist spirituality throughout and within Tibetan tradition. The Hinayana is understood not so much as a lower path that is later transcended, but rather as a foundation, which, if well laid, makes the journey through the higher yanas possible.
That's where we is.
So, as we've mentioned previously, Buddhism is also intensely practical. Let me give you the classic Buddhist example. We've sort of talked around this before, but we haven't actually looked at it in detail. At one point, one of the Buddha's disciples, Malunkyaputta, asked several metaphysical questions: whether the world is eternal or not, whether the world is finite or infinite, whether the soul and the body are identical or not, and about the existence of the Arhat after death. He received no reply. Instead, the Buddha related a parable. I've quoted this at some length to show his profound awareness of the incredible inventiveness of metaphysicians as they wrestle with ethereal subjects. Okay, so let's see who we can ask to do this one. Oh my goodness. Okay, David Erickson is next up here.
I thought I unmuted.
You
Okay.
tried to, but didn't take.
Okay, reading 7. Suppose, Malunkyaputta, a man were wounded by an arrow, thickly smeared with poison, and his friends and companions, his kinsmen and relatives, brought a surgeon to treat him. The man would say, I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know whether the man who wounded me was a noble or a Brahmin, or a merchant or a worker. And he would say, I will not let the surgeon pull out this arrow until I know the name and clan of the man who wounded me, until I know whether the man who wounded me was tall or short, or of middle height, until I know whether the man who wounded me was dark or brown or golden skinned, until I know whether the man who wounded me lives in such a village or town or city, until I know whether the bow that wounded me was a long bow or a crossbow, until I know whether the bowstring that wounded me was fiber or reed or sinew or hemp or bark, until I know with what kind of feathers the shaft that wounded me was fitted, whether those of a vulture or a heron or a hawk or a peacock or a stork, until I know with what kind of sinew the shaft that wounded me was bound, whether that of an ox or a buffalo or a deer or a monkey, until I know what kind of arrowhead it was that wounded me, whether spiked or razor tipped or curved or barbed or half-toothed or lancet shaped.
So many options. Okay. So maybe Leslie, you could finish this quote. It just continues on the next page here, a little bit more briefly.
All this would still not be known to that man, and meanwhile he would die. So too, Malunkyaputta, if anyone should say thus, I will not lead the holy life under the Blessed One until the Blessed One declares to me the world is eternal, or after death, a Tathagata neither exists nor does not exist, that would still remain undeclared by the Tathagata, and meanwhile that person would die.
Thank you. So clearly the injured man has a distorted sense of priorities. and will surely die before his questions, which are all beside the point during his moment of acute physical distress, are answered. The Buddha, on the other hand, as a skilled physician, is ready to pull the arrow out straight away. He will not answer questions that do not relate to the plight of mankind in a direct way. He referred to such metaphysical questions as indeterminables. Interestingly, Baha'u'llah also described himself as a divine physician, one who perceiveth the disease and prescribeth in his unerring wisdom the remedy. Both of them are very, very practical. So don't waste your time worrying about all the things related to the arrow. Okay, Jack, what are you going to offer us here?
Well, I was just going to say, Mark, you can deduce from this very, very interesting passage, one of the most interesting ones in the Buddhist scriptures that I remember. This is one of the ones that Professor Pummer quoted when we did World Religions years ago at Ottawa U. Very clearly, the Buddha felt that theology was part of the problem, not part of the solution.
Mm-hmm.
And it indicates to what extent the different sects of Hinduism got into all the subtle disputations about all these questions. And it also indicates how far gone the Buddha felt if his words have been reported accurately. It also indicates to what extent he felt the population of India had declined morally and ethically. There was an urgent need to reform manners and customs rather than thinking. Now, interestingly enough, Baha'u'llah answers all of these questions. About the eternity of the world and life after death. I mean, these are very legitimate questions for any religionist to ask himself or herself. But I guess what I'm deducing from that quotation is that the Buddha felt that theology had become very, very divisive and confusing, and he just was not going to go there. He didn't view his role to be an arbitrator, declare this particular school right and this one wrong, because that would have only contributed to, what's called odium theologicum, theological hatred that arises when these disputations arise in religion. So I'm just reinforcing what you're saying about the practical nature of his religion. And the other thing, in the previous quote, I mean, those of you who knew Tony Panalax in Gatineau, and we knew him for a long time until he passed away. And Tony was Tawville was his Thai name. And to me, he had this Buddhist tranquility, Mm-hmm. He really did, the compassionate Buddha, the tranquil Buddha. And so I think that part of the Buddha's teaching, Margaret, I don't know if that was your observation in Thailand too, but I think it's something that really permeated the culture. This gentility, this tranquility mm-hmm. that we see in Buddhists. I think that such really at the core, one of he's called the compassionate Buddha. And of course, the statues of the Buddha are meant above all to show his tranquility and his peace of mind. And I think that I've never traveled in the Far East, but if I took Tony Panalax as an example, he really had that wonderful calmness and tranquility about him, which I think probably is very Buddhist in origin.
I suspect you're right. I remember Tony from my years as a young person. So he's been in this area for decades and decades and decades. Okay, Belinda and David have their hand raised again.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I do. Anyway, I just wanted to say that, in Buddhism, this is not answered with regard to finite. I mean, eternity and so on and so forth. But I just wanted to say that Baha'u'llah, well, even the Bab, do refer to the concept of eternity because it relates to unity. And this is in the Four Valleys, and it's also in the Hidden Words. And the whole thing of, the universe, whether it's finite or infinite and so on and so forth, this in a way ties in with the concept of eternity. And I remember Baha'u'llah saying in the Hidden Words that in relation to unity, that he, God, I guess through Baha'u'llah, has created eternity for us, so that there is a reality there. And Abdu'l-Baha, as I'm sure you know, was asked about, the creation of the universe, and and he answered this. He said it's one of the most abstruse questions of philosophy. And but anyway, I just wanted to mention that.
Okay.
Mark, did you see that Margaret had her hand up?
I did. I was going to ask her if she
Change your
wanted
mind,
to say anything at this point.
Well, just adding what Jack was stating about the how you feel when you're in Thailand, although they have some political unrest, etc. The people are generally very poised and quite constrained and quite peaceful in many ways. And because my son-in-law has lived in Thailand for about 40 years, he's an American, and he says that North Americans tend to make themselves sometimes look quite childish if they're in a hotel and they start objecting to things, that their bill isn't right. The Thai people will often just stand there and sort of look at them as if they're looking at children and waiting for them to calm down and then try to get them to respond in a more adult way, I guess, in a way. So it's, yeah. I mean, obviously there's inroads of Western culture everywhere now, but, and changing how people are, but yeah, the culture is quite, it's a gentle culture and it's a nice country to be in.
Yeah, it's wonderful to hear stories about a real place that is Buddhist through and through. Most of us don't have experience with that. So thank you for that. I want to just briefly say something else about Hinayana Teachings. They outline a path of individual salvation through which the practitioner can attain liberation from samsara. The Hinayana practitioner is called a Shravaka, or hearer, somebody who listens, who hears the first turning teachings and applies them in his or her life. Also mentioned are the Pratikya Buddhas, who were meditators dwelling in remote places and aiming at liberation. These solitary practitioners are not members of the Shravaka lineages directly deriving from the Buddha. So the Hinayana vehicle was given this name, the lesser vehicle, to distinguish it from the Mahayana or greater vehicle, with its ideal of universal salvation. In order to fulfill this ideal, the Mahayana practitioner takes the Bodhisattva vow, striving to emulate the example of Shakyamuni Buddha themselves, being reborn countless times to help sentient beings and finally attaining the realization of a fully enlightened Buddha. The designation Hinayana, as it is used in the Mahayana, refers to the first step on the Mahayana path, in which one renounces samsara, takes refuge in the three jewels, those being the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha, and follows the path to extricate oneself from one's own suffering, attaining liberation. Seen from the point of view of the Mahayana, the Hinayana is an incomplete ideal, and at a certain point on the path needs to be transcended in favor of the more universal aspiration of the Mahayana. The Vajrayana Vehicle provides Buddhists with a wealth of methods of intensive meditation practice to assist them in fulfilling their bodhisattva vow. We'll delve into this vehicle when we study Tibetan Buddhism in a future class. The last topic I want to talk about tonight is the three turnings of Buddhism. According to Tibetan Buddhism, the biographies of the Buddha's life found in the Buddha Charita and other early texts, in which he is shown teaching only the Four Noble Truths and the salvation of the individual, are actually incomplete. This is because they do not mention those periods of his life in which he presented the more advanced teachings of the Mahayana and the Vajrayana. Vajrayana means the diamond vehicle, which is an allusion to the indestructible quality of true reality or emptiness. In the Indian texts found in the Tibetan canon, we learn that Shakyamuni Buddha first taught the Four Noble Truths, known as the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. This collection of instructions is known as the Hinayana to distinguish it from later teachings. What isn't mentioned in the early biographies is that later in his life, the Buddha turned the wheel of Dharma a second and then a third time, giving his audience teachings on emptiness and Buddha nature, respectively. Beyond these three turnings of the wheel of Dharma, he also gave initiations and instructions for what we may call the unconventional lineages of the Vajrayana, which we will talk about later. So why did the Buddha present his teachings in three turnings of the wheel of Dharma? Quite simply, the three turnings, also could be translated as promulgations, were addressed to the various needs and levels of sentient beings. This was a manifestation of the Buddha's skillful means, his upaya. He presented his teachings and practices to those with differing levels of spiritual receptivity. Okay, let's go back to our readings in number 9. Margaret, how about you?
Through his immaculate wisdom, Buddha Shakyamuni always taught after taking into account the abilities of the recipients. In other words, he would not teach at a level above a person's head. He adapted his teachings to what was suitable and appropriate to the listener. Therefore, we can say that those who heard his teachings only assimilated what was comprehensible to someone of their aptitude. Later, when they repeated what Buddha Shakyamuni had taught, their account was according to what they had perceived in their personal experience.
Okay, I think that's a good point. Each of us is limited in our understanding, and some of us are more advanced than others. So, as you can see from this chart, the three turnings are not identical to the three vehicles, although they are directly related to them. So, in the second column are the vehicles. The first column is the Sanskrit version of that word. So lesser vehicle is the occasion of the teaching was the first turning of the wheel of Dharma. When you get to the Mahayana, you have the second turning of the wheel of Dharma and then a third turn, both within Mahayana still. There isn't actually a turning of the wheel related to Vajrayana. That was the comment I was making about the initiations and instructions for the different lineages of the Vajrayana. So they're really supporting the ideas of the concepts, particularly of the second and the third turning. A little bit complicated, but now you can see the locations that have been identified for where these took place. And then the content of the teachers, we've already done the Four Noble Truths. We're going to talk about emptiness. And then in the third turning, we're going to talk about Buddha nature. And we will touch on the skillful means of Vajrayana near the end of our session on Buddhism. And then there are the main texts associated with each of these. I don't know if these names will be familiar to you at all or not, but you might have heard of the Abhidharma, for instance. You might have heard of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, and maybe the Lankavatara Sutra, and possibly Tantras. There are many, many, many of those. Okay. So just to review this, the Vajrayana is not considered to be a new turning because it does not present a new and distinctive view. It is better understood as bringing more concentrated forms of practice to hasten the attainment of the goals of the second and the third turning, primarily in the form of meditations. So these three vehicles were introduced or reintroduced in the cases of vehicles 2 and 3 to the Buddhist public at various times in history by specific individuals. And that's here. So the Buddha was responsible for all three. But the audience wasn't probably prepared to really hear about the second and the third until later. So Nagarjuna is the person who is responsible for the second turning with the teachings on emptiness. Asanga, who didn't live that many years later than Nagarjuna, is responsible for the three natures, the most important one of which is the Buddha nature that every single human being has. And that I would say is very close to the high concept of the trust of God that's deposited within each of us, of which most of the time we're completely ignorant. The same is true with the Buddha nature. The whole point of Buddhism is to identify yourself with that Buddha nature, to discover it within yourself. And so it creates not large numbers of gradual paths to that awakening, and also quite a few immediate ways of accessing it, which is similar to, if you look at the 7 valleys, you have the graduated 7 steps, and then Baha'u'llah at the end says it's possible to zip over all of them in one flash, which is the immediate path. So this is very similar as an approach to spiritual development to the Baha'i faith, although the specifics are going to be different. So as we'll learn in the final part of this course, Ken Wilber suggests that it's time for Buddhism to embrace a 4th turning in order to bring it up to date with discoveries made in the millennium and a half that has intervened since the inauguration of the 3rd turning. And he's recommending that that similar type of fourth turning occur in all the major religious traditions. He feels they've missed the boat. They've made themselves irrelevant to most people by not paying attention to the developments that have occurred in so many fields of consciousness that he's drawing attention to. So that's just a quick preview of where we're going.
Mark,
So-
I thought the Eightfold Path was the solution to the Four Noble Truths. That's the way the Buddhists usually
Yeah.
present it. So are you going to talk about the Eightfold Path as well, or?
I thought we already did.
Oh, okay, maybe that was last week when I wasn't there.
No, I think it was earlier.
Oh, okay, okay.
Yeah, no, the two are tied together. So that, I mean, the Eightfold Path is really the early form of Buddhist meditation, the Hinayana or Theravada version. Oh. In Tibetan Buddhism, there are two major ways in which individuals can follow the Buddhist path: the way of study and the way of meditation. While these two are usually combined in differing proportions by most Tibetans, it is useful to distinguish them. So here's how a representative of the practice lineage, which is the way of meditation, explains the way of study. So let's go back here. And I think we're at the beginning or back end of our list. Nina, are you able to read at this point?
Are you there, Nina?
I know she didn't have her video on, but I thought she
using
was
her phone
connected.
tonight. Mhm.
Well, okay. How about Eva?
Are you there, Eva?
Yeah, I am here.
Great.
Excellent.
The style of the scholar is to study numerous details and carefully reflect upon them, refining one's understanding through using the words of the Buddha, the statements of enlightened masters, and one's personal power of reasoning. By doing so, one can establish a clear understanding of the real state of things as they are. A strong fascination with critical questioning and analyzing prevents one from following the approach of a simple meditator and from gaining an immediate certainty about the profound nature of emptiness. The basis wakefulness is the very heart of all the Buddhas. Due to these reasons, some people find much greater benefit from the analytical approach of a scholar, through which doubts and lack of understanding can be gradually cleared away. This is one type of approach, and it is excellent.
Okay, now let's continue on. Let's see who we can ask. Linda Russell, how about you get to read number 11, which is a continuation, and this is the description of the way of meditation.
Another type of person feels less inclined to study all the details of the words of the Buddha and the statements of enlightened masters, or to investigate them with the power of factual reasoning. Rather, they wish to focus directly on the very core of the awakened state, the wakefulness that perceives every possible aspect of knowledge exactly as it is, personally within their own experience. Such people are not so interested in taking a long, winding, roundabout road through detailed studies and analytical speculations. Rather, they want immediate and direct realization. For such people, there is the approach of pith instructions on meditation, including Mahamudra and so I'm not sure how to pronounce that.
Dzogchen, it's called. You don't pronounce the D.
Okay, Dzogchen.
Dzogchen. Mhm. So these two preferred approaches to the investigation of the treasure chest of Buddhism lead directly to the gradual and to the immediate or direct paths to realization. And as I say, you probably have both of them, but in varying amounts. So for me, I mean, I would say I was 80, 85% probably in the first category, the study. There's a small part of me that's a little bit more comfortable with finding out for myself. In another person, it's going to be reversed. I mean, there are many, many options here. But depending on which one you're comfortable with, you're going to want either a gradual path or an immediate path. So let's stop sharing. That's enough information. Phew. Oh, there's Janice. I didn't see Janice. Hello. I like your glasses. Holy cow, they're bright. Well, folks.
Yes, I've been following sometimes on YouTube because I'm not always available on Wednesday nights, but I have to thank you for recording them, these talks for us. I mean, there's a lot of huge names for me, which I'll never be able to pronounce, just like a lot of Persian names, but
I'm having trouble too.
I doubt if I'll ever keep them straight, but anyhow, it's pretty interesting, the way you're presenting it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Okay, Harold, well, you got your hand up here. Oh, you just turned yourself off. You were on.
Yeah, I was dying to comment earlier on the second turning. Madhyamika, that school by Nagarjuna. Anyway, I looked into him a little bit, and I believe that he was a metaphysician. This is a different interpretation than you have offered. You've been saying repeatedly that Buddhism ignores metaphysics.
Oh, no, I said the Buddha did.
The Buddha did. Okay. Okay. However, the Buddha taught the doctrine of impermanence, and he also taught the doctrine of interdependent origination, as you showed us. And I'm interpreting them as metaphysical doctrines, that reality is more of a process than a substance. So it's funny, the word metaphysics has come to mean talking about things that abide eternally. And Buddhism is saying things do not abide eternally. That's a metaphysical position. And later on, it was called process philosophy by Whitehead, or process metaphysics, or process theology. In other words, here's another way of putting it. The guy Nagarjuna said he was teaching a middle way. Madhyamika means middle way. And it isn't the middle way that Buddha was talking about originally, but a middle way between saying things exist and things do not exist. So he was saying it's somewhere in between those two extremes of saying things exist eternally or saying no things exist at all. He's saying things are in process, things are developmental, things change, there's dependent origination. There's the doctrine of impermanence. Things are impermanent, which means they develop across time. So Buddhism is a powerful metaphysic of change and development and of process. So I don't think it's correct to say that the Buddha didn't teach metaphysics, or that Buddhism itself in its later development doesn't develop metaphysics. In fact, process metaphysics is very close to Baha'i metaphysics. But we add to that there are some things that abide eternally, and we're taught about them. But a lot of Baha'i teaching emphasizes development change, advancement, progress. So anyway, I'm just giving you an alternate interpretation of the metaphysics of Buddhism, which to me are also very consistent with science. Science says the world is full of processes and events.
So I'm thinking, Harold, as you're talking, I don't disagree with what you're saying. But I'm looking back at how I've presented this, and I'm thinking I probably should have spent more time talking about the indeterminables that the Buddha was refusing to talk about. I think that would have centered us a little bit more safely, instead of just using the term metaphysics, which is much more all-encompassing.
You know, but here's a point about the indeterminables. I think Buddha is saying it's neither this nor this, which to me says it's somewhere in between. So there's an implicit metaphysic even in his talking about indeterminables. He's also saying, don't worry your minds about that, because you know, there's more than one way to look at that. You know, it's a learning process. This is the way Baha'is like to put it. Anyway, so even no matter how you go, there is no escape from metaphysics. That's what I'm saying. The religions talk about reality. Metaphysics is about the structure and function and processes of reality. There is no escape from metaphysics. There's also no escape from ethics either. Right. So the Buddha said, yeah, we've had too much metaphysics, you know, in the 1500 years before he arrived. So we're going to turn the direction toward, you know, ethical emphases, overcoming suffering, compassion, taking care of people, empathizing with pain. Anyway, but there's no way of getting away from metaphysics, I believe.
Okay, excellent point. Okay, David.
Yeah. Well, I agree with Harold. He mentioned science. Certainly today, when it comes to physics, you know, in quantum mechanics, there is a parallel. What we have discovered in relation to the reality of the world, which in physics they're still, you know, questioning. Nevertheless, you know, it gets into the realm of what Nagarjuna was talking about or was writing about, because emptiness, it, you know, doesn't really mean nothingness in the sense that we understand it at all. Nothing exists by itself, nothing at all, you know, so that if you want to treat everything as a particular thing, you can forget it. Doesn't exist. But in terms of relationship or interrelationship, that makes the big difference. Everything exists because of relationship. And that's how we have to see these things. And this is something that I think is happening in physics. And I think it's very, very important. So I just wanted to mention that.
As you were talking, I was thinking a little bit facetiously that what you're describing is the Matrix.
Well, right? I have that out to see it again.
Interconnected nature of reality.
Yeah.
But is there something behind it?
Buddha called that Indra's net. Indra's net, the interdependent relationship of all things, which is a powerful metaphysic, a process metaphysic, consistent with you know, theoretical physics these days and quantum mechanics.
Exactly. Yeah.
Everything is connected. Everything changes. Pay attention. I wanted to comment since we
and don't cling, right? Don't cling to anything.
Melinda wants to make one comment.
Well, looking at these maps you presented us with was quite entertaining because they're so colorful. And looking at the historical aspects of these maps, I wanted to comment that I've become very acutely aware of the fact that certainly my education and that of many other people in the Western world is so Eurocentric that we're very unaware of what was going on in other parts of the world. BC and the Common Era and so forth. You know, the interest in, say, the Mongol expansions. Well, they got to the gates of Europe and then they stopped. You know, and so forth. And we had the Black Death in Europe, and totally overlooking how it got to Europe, and how it spread through the Islamic world and through right across Eurasia from China on. And there's so much we don't know sort of about the history of other parts of the Eurasia. It's a huge continent. Just get a map that shows you the whole bloody continent. You know, it's huge. And when you start thinking about the numbers of different people that live there and have lived there and will live there and so forth, it's quite almost traumatic to realize this. And so I'm kind of grateful for those maps you gave us, because I look at them and I think, wow, there was a whole lot of stuff going on there that we know very little about. I know very little about. And just to mention two things, how many of us know who invented paper?
I did.
China. I know you know that. And who invented gunpowder? China. And where was it first used? In India. As a weapon. Anyway, that's I'll just leave all that. It's very interesting. Oh yes, and I could say a few things about Buddhism and Islam and all this too, but we'll leave it.
Okay, Jack, you're patiently waiting here. What?
Oh, no problem. Well, I just say for those of us who struggle through the seven valleys, there is a statement of Baha'u'llah. Mark, you said, you know, correctly, that he said we can traverse them in a single breath. 7 steps, nay, a single breath. In the introduction to the Call of the Divine Beloved, which includes the 7 valleys and the 4 valleys and some other mystical tablets, the editors of that book, which of course was done in Haifa, quote Baha'u'llah as saying that anybody who believes in him has already traversed the 7 valleys. So there you go. That's a bit, that's encouragement for those of us who think we'll never make it. But I was going to say that the Zen Buddhist and Thich Nhat Hanh, who died recently at a ripe old age, it was the path, he taught the path of immediate realization, not the intellectual path. You wouldn't, and that's the path of Zen. It's the path of Satori awakening, and, you know, as opposed to study and analysis, right? Now, I've dabbled a little bit into Buddhist theology, and it's very difficult to get your head around it at first, because what they're doing, it seems to me, that the 2 words neti, neti, no, no. It seems to me what they're doing is they're trying to get to the positives by way of the negative. In other words, they're saying reality X is not this, 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 and this. So when you eliminate those things, you get to this, which is the fundamental reality. So of the thing, whatever it happens to be. So a useful way to approach this shunyata or emptiness for a Baha'i is, of course, to look at the last of the 7 valleys. I don't know, Mark, if you're going to do that. Would be a very interesting comparative study, because basically it's the same thing. Baha'u'llah says you get to absolute nothingness, which is the ultimate, where you cease to live and God lives in you. When you eliminate, when all of these other things have been eliminated, you will be there because it's inherent within the human soul. And there are all these veils that prevent us from attaining that state. But once these veils are removed, then it happens. And, you know, we've all experienced that in different ways at different times in our lives when we've had peak experiences or whatever, when we seem to see the world, we see the world in a new way. We haven't changed. It's just that the veils or the filters have been removed so we can see more clearly. And that I think is what they're trying to get at in Buddhism, that they're trying to, I see Harold shaking his head, so he must agree with me. That's amazing, Harold. No, I'm just kidding. So it seems to me that that's the process of what this neti, no. It seems to me that it's attaining the positive by the way of the negative. And so it is hard to get your head around. I mean, I've struggled with some Buddhist texts. What the heck are they talking about? And we'll see. It's a very different approach. That the whole path of negativity. It's definitely a different way of looking at the world.
What some of the reading I'm doing right now is describing it as the goal being beyond conceptual thinking. Non-conceptual is how to describe nature. So all the thoughts you have about what reality is, etc., are undercut immediately. So everything that you hold dear as your insights into how the world works, etc., are going to be torpedoed by this. And that's not exactly what you call comfortable process to go through.
That's right. Reality is not attained by thinking.
Yeah.
Thinking is a means of arriving at truth. Reality is attained through experience.
Yeah.
And if anybody's had a mystical experience, they'll know what I'm talking about. It's the most real of the real things, but it's not a discursive process where you go through a logical steps, trying to figure out what is true and what isn't true. It's more of an immediate perception of reality.
I love the word that they use in Sufism for that. They talk
Tasting.
about it, tasting.
Yeah.
Or drinking. So it's an immediate sensation where you have nothing standing in between you and the reality. David.
Well, I just want to make just one little comment about that. You know, first, you know, as I get older, I feel I don't know anything. And I really don't. I read about Buddhism. I read about, you know, I read all kinds of things, you know, and but just the same, I feel that I don't really know anything. And I think for me, the whole foundation of knowing anything about reality in terms of what it is to know that you don't know anything, you know, really. And I think that that for me anyway is something that's very important.
Well, what you're talking about is that it isn't an object out there.
Yeah.
That you can grasp.
Yeah.
It's something you have to immerse yourself in. Like
Well,
the
David,
Old
you've
words.
joined Socrates because he said, I know that I know nothing.
Well, I know that. And then he goes, and then he proceeds, you know, to tell everybody else that, you know, shows all kinds of doubt in other people's minds and so on and so forth, you know, and, you know, yeah.
So
I think-
once you,
I think
Sure,
he
go
knew. I think he knew. But, you know, the whole basis of knowing is unknowing. The whole basis of knowing anything really is not to know. And I think that this is something that's very important to know, for us to know.
Netty, 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 netty.
Oh, brother.
so now that we're all through the 7 valleys, we have to go through the 4 stages of the heart,
Ah,
which is
yeah.
where we are at the moment, right?
yeah.
Oh, yes.
And the heart has many stages.
So that's really what we're exploring, is those stages.
Well, look at, for example, when you pointed out, and it's been very important to me, you know, the tablet of, what am I thinking?
Oh, heck no.
No.
Oh, there's another tablet?
No, the Surah of
Oh, room, the Surah.
Surah of Room, yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and that I know is very important to you. And it's very, very interesting. And Abdul Baha's commentary on it. And he outlines, if I'm not mistaken, various levels of the human soul.
Mhm.
And this relates also to the human heart. It's very, very interesting.
Well, it's worth going back to that document, I think, at the end of the process. And that's probably what I'll do once we finish with Ken Wilber, is come back to that document and see where we're at, see if we've gained any new insights into what he was talking about.
Right.
Oh, Bill, you're lying back there looking pretty comfortable. What is it you're going to say?
Well, it's my failing and I couldn't resist, but I just wanted to say that as I get older, I also think that David doesn't know anything.
Become abundantly clear to everyone.
Well, I consider that's a compliment. Thank you, Bill.
Very nice. That's a great note to end on.
It's kind of like, hallelujah, I'm an ignoramus. Ignorance is bliss.
Yeah, it's a state we're all familiar with.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, folks, well, I think I'm going to leave it there. Whew. So,
Well, thank you, Mark. Thank you for all your assiduous
Your
research.
effort, Mark, is just absolutely tremendous. It really, really is. And Linda too. You know, I think it's just remarkable what you guys have done.
well, we're not there yet.
Lots more to come.
Hey,
We're never there.
it's the process.
There's more to
that
say.
The process.
Yeah, that's right.
And of consistency over the years, right, David? Like, it's not a fly by night. You and Linda, you're very capable pilot and assistant. You know,
Yeah,
you've been doing this for years now, which is wonderful.
yeah,
And we've all benefited so much from it.
yeah.
I know her.
That's
So
right.
you've
Thank you.
become more and more unknowing as I talk. Is that what you're saying?
Unknowing, yes, indeed.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Linda.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everybody. It's wonderful to see you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, well, let's
Good night.
say goodnight and say goodnight to the
Good night.
rain.
Well, everybody.
Thank you.
Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar,
Oh.
Khuda Hafiz.
Shabbat bekheer.
Hey, take care.
Shabbat.
Night.
Night.